My parents showed up unannounced after 7 years, smiling, arms outstretched, asking to meet my kids. I handed them two framed photos of my twins and shut the door. They stood frozen, caught between the absurdity of my gesture and the weight of their own history. I didn't owe them an explanation, but I gave them one anyway. This is the only version of my children you get. 7 years of silence, not a single call when I got promoted, no congratulations when I married, not even a card when I gave birth to the only grandchildren they'll ever have. I built a life without them because I had to, because they chose my sister over me again and again, until there was nothing left to give. Now they wanted a seat at the table, access to a life they opted out of. I shut the door not in anger, but in finality. They never saw it coming. And honestly, neither did I, until the moment I did it. Growing up, I didn't realize there was a hierarchy in love. I thought that's just how families worked. Some people got the spotlight and others were just expected to keep clapping. My sister Hannah was born 3 years after me, but from the very beginning, it felt like she had always been the favorite. She had the kind of glow that made people stop and smile. Teachers adored her, relatives fawned over her. My parents, they worshipped her. They called her their little miracle, their bright light, their future. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the background character in a play where she was always the star. But I didn't resent her, not at first. I loved her. I loved all of them. I thought maybe that's just how things were when you weren't as shiny. So I tried harder. I helped around the house, took care of Hannah when she had the flu, stayed up late to quiz her for tests, even when I had my own homework to finish. I once rewrote her entire English paper because she forgot it was due. My parents were so impressed with her grade, they took her out for ice cream. I stayed home and washed the dishes. I remember getting into UCLA, I was so proud. First in my class to be accepted into a top-tier school, I ran into the kitchen, holding the letter, breathless, excited. My mom glanced at it and said, "That's great, sweetie. Did you hear? Hannah's going to Stanford." It was like someone poured cold water over my joy. Still, I kept showing up. Holidays, birthdays, family dinners. I came, I smiled, I brought gifts. I listened to stories about Hannah's internships, her promotions, her amazing boyfriend. No one asked me how my job was going or if I was dating anyone. I became an accessory to someone else's narrative. When our grandfather got sick, I was the one who stepped up. I took time off work. I stayed with him. I made his meals, took him to appointments, held his hand during those long, lonely nights. He told me I had my grandmother's strength, that I was the glue holding the family together, even if no one else saw it. After he passed, I gave a quiet eulogy. I talked about his kindness, his stories, the way he always remembered my favorite candy. My parents barely mentioned it. Instead, they gushed over Hannah's tearful speech, how moving and powerful it was. Even though she hadn't seen him in his final month, I tried not to let it get to me. After college, I landed a job at a major advertising agency. It was competitive, intense, and I thrived. I poured myself into my work, 12-hour days, back-to-back campaigns, awards I hung in my apartment but never showed off. When I called my mom to tell her about my first big promotion, she said, "Oh, that's nice. Did Hannah help you get it?" "No," I said, "I got it on my own." There was a pause. Then she said, "Well, she's always been such a good influence on you." But once I flew across the country just to surprise them for Christmas. I showed up at the door with gifts and a smile. My mom opened it and said, "Oh, you should have called first. The house is a mess." Hannah arrived an hour later and got a full hug, hot cocoa, and a plate of cookies. I sat in the corner that night, wondering what more I could do to earn a place at the table. It wasn't until I started therapy that I even admitted out loud how much it hurt, how exhausting it was to constantly seek approval that never came. My therapist asked me, "Do you feel loved by your family?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. But even then, I kept showing up, kept believing deep down that maybe love had to be earned, that if I just became more successful, more helpful, more impressive, maybe they'd see me. Maybe they'd finally say, "We're proud of you." But they never did. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand love given only under conditions isn't love at all. It's control. Looking back, the signs were always there. At first, they were subtle, easy to dismiss if I wasn't paying attention, which I often wasn't, because I didn't want to see them. I remember one Christmas when I bought everyone personalized gifts. I spent weeks choosing them, thoughtful things I knew they'd love. I gave my dad a leather-bound journal for his writing hobby, my mom a necklace with all our birthstones, and Hannah a handmade candle set I'd seen her eyeing online. They smiled, thanked me politely. An hour later, Hannah handed out her gifts, matching robes for the family, each embroidered with names. My mom teared up, my dad clutches to his chest like a child. They wore them the entire weekend. It wasn't about the robes, it was about who gave them. Another time, Hannah was hosting a fundraiser at her firm and needed volunteers. I canceled a weekend trip to help, spent 2 full days setting up, organizing check-ins, cleaning afterward. When mom asked how it went, she looked straight at Hannah and said, "You're amazing. How did you do it all by yourself?" I opened my mouth to speak, but something stopped me. The silence was too familiar. I just smiled. Birthdays became another ritual of hierarchy. For Hannah's, we had dinner reservations, cakes with her name in gold script, long toasts from our parents. For mine, it was usually a text, sometimes a call if they remembered. One year, my dad sent me a generic e-card. I think it still had the stock name on it. "Happy birthday, Amanda." And yet, I excused it all. I told myself they were busy, distracted, maybe just not great at showing emotion. I buried my hurt under rationalizations. It wasn't until I started dating Chris, my now husband, that someone finally looked at it all and said, "This isn't normal." Chris met them during our second year together. He was polite, attentive, tried hard to connect. They barely acknowledged him. At dinner, my dad asked him 3 questions, all about what he could do for me financially. My mom turned to me midway through and whispered, "I always imagined you with someone more like your sister's type." That night, I cried in the car. Chris just held my hand. When we got engaged, I was nervous to tell them. I don't know why. I wasn't asking for permission, but some part of me still hoped they'd be happy. My mom barely reacted. My dad asked, "So, are you guys going to do something small?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That makes sense." No offer to help, no excitement, just detached politeness. Hannah got engaged the following year. My parents threw her an engagement party with over 80 guests. They rented a rooftop space, catered a 3-course meal, had a violinist. I wasn't invited. When I asked my mom why, she said, "Well, we assumed you'd be busy." I was always busy when it came to things that actually mattered. But it wasn't just big events, it was daily life. When I got a promotion, they barely reacted. When I bought my first home, they didn't visit for 6 months. When Chris and I announced we were pregnant, with twins, no less, they said, "Oh, wow, double trouble." That was it. Meanwhile, when Hannah bought a puppy, they sent care packages. I began to notice a pattern in everything. My achievements were minimized, my pain overlooked, and my presence tolerated, not celebrated. It's strange how long you can live in a fog before you realize you're suffocating. I wanted so badly to believe that I just needed to be more successful, more accommodating, more patient, but no amount of more ever moved the needle. Eventually, you stop reaching out when no one reaches back. Eventually, you stop asking for love that's always been conditional. Eventually, you start to see the truth. Maybe it was never about me falling short. Maybe they just never wanted to see me at all. There was one evening just a few months before my wedding when I called my mom just to talk. I had a rough day, and all I wanted was to hear her voice, to feel like I mattered. She answered, distracted. Hannah had just gotten back from a trip to Greece and was sending photos. I could hear my mom gushing in the background, narrating each image as if they were postcards from royalty. I waited 10 minutes, listening to her go on and on until she finally said, "Sorry, sweetie, what did you call about again?" I told her, never mind, that I just wanted to say hi. "Okay, love you," she chirped, already turning back to Hannah's texts. That night, I stared at my ceiling and wondered how many more times I would have to shrink myself just to fit into their frame. The answer, I eventually realized, was none. The final blow came wrapped in legal language and polite silence. It started with a call from a distant cousin. "Hey," she said cautiously, "I heard your grandparents passed. I'm so sorry." My heart dropped. I hadn't known. I hadn't even been told. I hung up and immediately called my mom. No answer. I tried again, still nothing. Eventually she texted back, "Yes, it happened last week. Things were hectic." Hectic. That's all she said. My grandparents had helped raise me. When my parents were busy with Hannah's rehearsals or trips or anything else, it was my grandma who made me lunch, who listened to me talk about books and boys and dreams. Grandpa used to read to me every night, even after I learned to read myself. Their house was the only place I felt completely seen, and they died without me even getting a chance to say goodbye. The funeral had already happened. Private ceremony, she said, just family. When I asked why I wasn't told, she said, "We didn't want to stress you." That was the moment something inside me broke. I asked about the will. My parents were the executors. She got quiet, then said everything went to Hannah. It's what made the most sense. I was stunned. Everything? Yes, she said, her voice defensive now. Hannah was always closer to them. Closer? I had lived with them for months in high school when my parents were figuring things out. I had driven grandma to her doctor's appointments every summer during college. I had called grandpa weekly just to hear his voice. But none of that counted, apparently, not enough to matter. I asked to see the documents. She hesitated, then told me if I wanted to pursue anything, I'd have to get a lawyer. She said it like a threat. I didn't want the money. I wanted acknowledgement, proof that I wasn't invisible to the people who meant so much to me. Instead, I got silence. Hannah never reached out. She posted a tribute on Instagram, a black and white photo of grandma holding her as a baby, captioned, "Forever my angel." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just watched quietly as my history was rewritten without me in it. A week later, I received a package in the mail, no note, no explanation, just a small box with 2 photo albums and a ceramic mug I'd made in 3rd grade. The kind of thing you'd toss into a donation bin during a spring clean. That was their way of including me, I guess. I stared at the albums for hours. Flipping through, I saw dozens of photos. Birthdays, vacations, holidays. In almost every single one, Hannah was front and center. Me? Off to the side, or sometimes not pictured at all. I started to cry. Not out of sadness, but from something deeper, a grief I didn't have words for. It wasn't just about my grandparents, it was the years of being overlooked, of loving people who saw me as optional. That night, I told Chris everything. He didn't speak for a while, then he said, "You know this isn't love, right?" I nodded, because I did know. I just didn't want it to be true. A few days later, I wrote my parents a letter. Not angry, just honest. I told them how hurt I was to be excluded, to not even be told about the death of people who helped raise me. I told them how it felt to be erased. I didn't ask for anything, just clarity. They never responded. That was the last time I tried to reach out. I didn't go home for Thanksgiving. I didn't send Christmas cards. When they eventually noticed and texted, "Are you okay?" I replied, "Yes." Nothing more. It was the beginning of my silence, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. I had spent my whole life yelling into a void, hoping for an echo. Now I let the silence speak for me. And in that silence, I finally began to hear myself. I think what gutted me most wasn't the inheritance. It wasn't even the funeral. It was the ease with which they erased me. Started to wonder, had I ever truly been in their picture? Or was I just the placeholder, something to round out the narrative, the other daughter that made Hannah shine brighter? I remember when Grandpa was in hospice care, I would drive for hours just to sit beside him. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just listened to classical music and watched the trees sway outside his window. One day, he squeezed my hand and said, "You're steady. That's rare." I wrote those words down and kept them in my wallet. But my parents hadn't seen those moments, or worse, they saw it and decided they didn't matter. The injustice of it festered inside me. I started waking up in the middle of the night, chest tight, dreams filled with voices saying, "You were never enough." I'd lie awake next to Chris, silently crying, trying not to wake him. I thought about reaching out to Hannah, but what would I say? Congrats on the inheritance? Thanks for letting me find out from a cousin that our grandparents died? I couldn't stomach pretending everything was normal. Not anymore. Then one day, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a single check made out to me signed by my parents. A sizable amount. Blood money. I stood in my kitchen holding that check, staring at it like it might catch fire. It wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was a bribe. A payoff. A pathetic attempt to patch over years of silence with something that looked like generosity. I ripped it up. Chris walked in, saw the pieces on the counter, and simply nodded. He didn't ask. He didn't have to. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't write another letter. I didn't even feel angry. Just done. You spend your whole life trying to prove you deserve a seat at the table, and then one day you realize you've built your own, and there's no space left for people who only show up when it benefits them. I wasn't heartless. I mourned them in my own way. I lit candles for my grandparents. I looked through old photos. I cried when no one was watching. But I also promised myself something. I would never let anyone make me feel invisible again. Not even my own blood. In the weeks that followed, I spiraled. There wasn't some dramatic collapse. No shouting, no crying in the rain. It was quieter than that. More dangerous, in a way. I'd wake up, stare at the ceiling, and feel nothing. I went to work. I responded to emails. I smiled at meetings. But inside, I was a blank page. Chris noticed. Of course he did. He'd ask gently if I wanted to talk. I'd say I was just tired, which wasn't a lie. I was tired of trying, of pretending, of carrying this quiet ache everywhere I went. The worst part was that the pain didn't have a single face. It wasn't just my parents. It wasn't just the inheritance or the funeral. It was everything. Years of not being enough, of being the understudy in my own life. Some nights, I couldn't sleep. I'd scroll through old photos, trying to find one where I looked truly happy. Not just smiling, but happy. Most of them were from college or with Chris. Very few included my family. I started skipping meals. Not intentionally, I just didn't care. Food tasted like paper. I'd open the fridge, stare at the shelves, and walk away. Chris started cooking more, leaving plates on my desk with little notes. "Eat, please. Fuel your fire. I love you." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. I went to therapy but found myself shutting down. I'd sit across from my therapist and smile. "Everything's fine." She didn't push. She just said, "When you're ready." And one night I had a dream. I was back in my childhood home. I was in the hallway, but the walls were closing in. Every door I opened led to a room filled with Hannah's things. Trophies, photos, awards. I kept searching for something of mine. A drawing, a book, a single framed picture. There was nothing. I woke up gasping. That morning, I finally broke. I sat on the floor of our kitchen and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. Chris found me there, knees pulled to my chest. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside me and held my hand. I told him everything, every hurt I had buried, every time I felt forgotten, every moment I wanted to scream but didn't. I told him I was scared, scared I was unlovable, that I'd never be enough for anyone, even him. He listened, and then he said, "You don't have to earn love, you just have to let it in." It sounds simple, but it shattered something inside me. I'd spent so long building my identity around rejection that I didn't know who I was without it. I was terrified to let go of the pain because at least it was familiar. But I started trying. Small steps. I made a real meal one night. I called a friend from college and told her I missed her. I bought a plant and didn't let it die. I started journaling, not about my family, but about myself, who I was, who I wanted to be. There were setbacks. Days I'd stare at the wall and wonder if healing was even possible. But then I'd remember Chris's words that I didn't have to prove anything. I just had to be. One evening, as the sun set behind our apartment, I stood by the window and watched the lights spill across the floor. And for the first time in a long time, I felt still. Not fixed, not healed, but still. It was enough. I started walking in the mornings, not for exercise, just to feel the world again, to hear the sound of my shoes on the pavement, to remind myself that I existed, that I took up space, that I was real. On one of those walks, I passed a little girl holding her father's hand. She was telling him something about her drawing at school, and he was listening, really listening. His eyes were on her, nodding, smiling, like what she said mattered. I had to stop and sit on a bench. That scene gutted me more than any argument ever could, because I realized I'd spent most of my childhood talking to people who only half listened. I was that little girl once, but no one was looking at me like that, and yet I survived. I had to believe that meant something. Chris kept showing up in little ways that mattered. He never tried to fix me. He just made space for the sadness, for the silence, for the slow return of color. There were nights I still cried, sometimes without knowing why, but now I didn't cry alone. Feeling wasn't loud. It was quiet, uneven. One day I'd feel okay. The next, a single smell or song would take me down. But slowly I started reaching for life again. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. Recovery didn't come in a grand cinematic moment. It came in pieces, in quiet victories. The first time I laughed, really laughed, was while watching a dumb sitcom with Chris. I don't even remember the joke, but I remember the warmth that followed. Like something inside me had been defrosted. That same week, I reorganized my closet, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel some sense of control. I found old jeans I hadn't worn in years and tried them on just for fun. They didn't fit, and I laughed. Not the bitter kind, but the free kind. That was new. Journaling more seriously, not just what happened, but what I felt. I wrote letters I never sent to my mom, my dad, even to Hannah. I wrote things I couldn't say out loud about pain and anger, but also about hope. Some days, the pages were filled with rage. Other days, with softness. Then came the day I set boundaries, not in my head, but out loud. My mom called one afternoon, months after the silence had settled. Her voice was cheerful, casual, like nothing had happened. She asked about the twins, asked if we could meet up soon. "I'd love to see the babies," she said, like she hadn't erased me from my grandparents' funeral, like she hadn't sent a check instead of an apology. I took a breath. My heart raced, but my voice didn't shake. "I'm not comfortable with that right now," I said. A pause. Then, "Why are you being so cold?" "I'm not being cold," I replied. "I'm protecting my peace." I ended the call with a calm goodbye. No tears, no guilt, just clarity. That night, I cried, but not out of sadness, out of release. I had finally chosen myself. From there, things got easier. Not perfect, but lighter. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from during the worst of it. We met for coffee, shared stories, laughed about things that had nothing to do with pain. I hosted brunch. I let people in. Slowly, I remembered how much joy could exist when you're not constantly performing for approval. And I started creating new traditions with my own family. Chris and I made Saturday pancakes a thing. The twins, just over 1 year old now, would sit in their high chairs flinging batter like it was finger paint. We played music in the kitchen, we danced like fools. And for the first time, I wasn't haunted by the love I never got. I was too busy giving the love I'd always deserved. I also stopped hiding my story. When a colleague at work mentioned strained family dynamics, I didn't just nod and move on. I shared carefully, honestly, about what I'd been through, and instead of judgment, I got understanding. It reminded me that so many of us carry invisible wounds, and that maybe by sharing, I could help someone else feel less alone. I joined a local writing group, not to write about my trauma, but to write at all. Fiction, essays, anything. It was freeing to create something that wasn't about surviving, but imagining, building. I still had bad days, triggers, moments where a smell, a phrase, a photo could pull me back, but I had tools now. Breathing exercises, journals, Chris's hand, and most importantly, the voice inside me that no longer whispered, "You're not enough." It said, "You are here and you matter." As rebuilding, not the life they wanted for me, but the life I chose for myself. And piece by piece, I was finally becoming whole. One afternoon, as I watched the twins nap, their tiny chests rising and falling in sync, I realized something simple but profound. I was the mother I had always needed. I showed up, I listened, I saw them, and I knew I would never let them feel like an afterthought. That realization anchored me. It became my North Star when doubt crept in. When the echoes of my parents' disappointment whispered in the back of my mind, I looked at my children and knew this cycle ends with me. We don't always get to choose the families we're born into, but we do get to choose the kind of family we build. And I was building something beautiful. I wasn't healed. Healing isn't a destination, it's a decision made over and over. But I was living, I was loving, and more importantly, I was finally loving myself. Every day, I chose myself a little more. And that choice, quiet and steady, was the most powerful thing I had ever done. It happened on a Saturday morning. The doorbell rang as we were cleaning up after breakfast, pancake batter still drying on the twins' bibs, Chris humming to some 90s playlist in the kitchen. I opened the door without thinking, and there they were, my parents. They looked older, grayer. My mom's eyes were puffy like she'd been crying. My dad stood behind her, hands in his pockets, unsure. It had been 7 years since we last saw each other face to face. "Hi, sweetheart," my mom said, voice soft. "We were hoping we could meet the kids." I didn't say anything at first. My body was frozen, not with fear but calculation. Then I stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind me. They looked startled. "I don't understand," my mom said, confused. "Don't we deserve to meet them? We're their grandparents." "You gave that title away," I said calmly. "But we've changed," she insisted. "We've had time to think, to regret." I look at my father. "Have you?" He didn't answer. I folded my arms. "Why now, after all these years?" They exchanged glances. My mom hesitated, then blurted, "Hannah isn't having kids. She and her partner, they've decided, and we realized you're our only chance." There was the truth. Not love, not remorse, just scarcity. "I see," I said. "So I was never enough to love for who I was. But now that I'm a vessel for the next generation, suddenly I matter?" "We didn't mean it like that." My father started. "No," I cut in. "You didn't mean a lot of things. But meaning doesn't erase impact." They tried to appeal to reason, to time lost, to moving forward. But I didn't waver. I built this life without you, I said. Not because I wanted to, but because you made it clear I wasn't welcome in yours. You don't get to parachute back in because your golden child isn't giving you what you want. My mom cried. My dad looked down. They stood there, small against the weight of their own choices. And then I did something unexpected. I handed them 2 framed photos of the twins. These are yours, I said, not because you deserve them, but because I've made peace with what you took from me. This is as close as you get. Their hands trembled as they accepted the pictures. I turned, walked back inside, and locked the door behind me. Chris was standing in the hallway holding one of the twins. You okay? I nodded, better than I've ever been. We spent the rest of the day at the park. The kids played in the sun. I lay on the grass and looked up at the sky, marveling at how light I felt. That night, I got an email from my sister. Subject line, "So they came to you too?" Her message was short, apologetic even. She explained her choice to be child-free and how our parents had turned on her for it, how she now understood what it meant to be discarded. I stared at the screen for a long time, and then I hit delete. No anger, no revenge, just boundaries. That was my power. Not shouting, not exposing, but choosing what and who got access to my peace. And I wasn't trading that for anything. The next day, I received another message, this time from my father. It was longer, thoughtful even. He wrote about regret, about watching my childhood slip by while he cheered too loudly for someone else. He said he didn't know how to fix it, but wanted to try. I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't mean reunion. It meant release. And I was no longer interested in building bridges over foundations that had never been solid in the first place. Instead, I redirected that energy inward. I printed out a photo of my younger self, 10 years old, eyes hopeful, and taped it to my bathroom mirror. Every morning, I looked into her face and whispered, "I see you. You are enough." It felt silly at first, then sacred. I began speaking at support groups, not as an expert, just as someone who understood the ache of being unseen. I met women with similar stories, daughters, sons, even mothers, who had clawed their way towards self-worth. Together, we laughed, we cried, we healed. One evening after a meeting, a woman hugged me tightly and said, "I thought I was crazy for cutting off my family. You made me feel sane." I drove home in tears, not because I was sad, because I was proud. All those years of silence had turned into something powerful, not a weapon, a voice. And I finally knew how to use it. Years ago, I would have given anything to be chosen by them. Now I choose myself. And in doing so, I've created a life richer, fuller, and more honest than anything they ever offered. That is my legacy. That is my revenge. And it's wrapped not in bitterness, but in joy. And every single day, I live it with no apologies. I used to think love was something I had to earn through achievement, through compliance, through being the quiet one, the good one, the invisible glue that held everyone else together. But now, love feels different. It's Chris bringing me tea before I ask. It's my children squealing when I walk through the door. It's the way I laugh with my friends, loud and unfiltered. It's peace, not pressure. One afternoon, while reading to the twins, my daughter pointed to a picture of a tree and said, "This one looks like our backyard." She was right, it did. It made me think of roots, how some grow deep even in harsh soil, and how others, like mine, choose to stretch in new directions, finding sunlight where it wasn't offered. I've become that kind of tree. My family, Chris, the twins, our community, is not one I was born into, it's one I built. Every boundary laid, every toxic tie cut, every honest conversation had was a brick in the foundation of something sacred, The home I was denied became the home I created. And within that home, I redefined love, not as obligation, but as intention. My kids won't grow up wondering if they're enough. They won't earn love with straight A's or quiet obedience. They'll know they are loved because they exist. And I won't just tell them, I'll show them in how I listen, in how I stay, in how I choose them over and over without conditions. Lately, people have asked if I'll ever reconnect with my parents, if maybe years from now, I'll forgive and forget. But I think forgiveness is often missed. It doesn't always look like a hug or a holiday reunion. Sometimes it looks like no longer carrying their shame, like not flinching when someone says family, like choosing joy even if they never get to see it. I've forgiven them, but I haven't forgotten. And I don't need to reopen old wounds to prove I've healed. Healing, I've learned, is quiet. It's knowing I can look at my past and not drown. It's dancing in the kitchen with my husband, kids giggling nearby, and realizing I never needed their approval to be whole. That's the real legacy I'm leaving, not the one they tried to shape me into, but the one I carved out with my own hands. And it is enough. I've started writing letters to my children, not because I expect them to need them, but because I want them to always have my voice, even long after I'm gone. I write about the day they were born, about the first time they called me mama, about the nights they couldn't sleep and how I rocked them until sunrise, whispering promises into their hair. I tell them the truth, not just the pretty parts. I told them I was scared sometimes, that I made mistakes, that I doubted myself, but that I never, not for 1 second, doubted them. I want them to know love isn't perfect, but it is steady and it is theirs, unconditionally. The more I write, the more I realize I'm also writing to that younger version of me, the girl who used to sit alone on the school bus, staring out the window, hoping her mom would show up to the science fair, the one who kept her report cards like trophies, hoping they'd buy her a place in their hearts. I wish I could go back and wrap her in my arms. I can't, but I can give her what she never had through the way I raise my children, through the life I've chosen to live. And maybe that's what healing really is, the act of giving to others what was once withheld from you. There's a quiet power in that. A legacy not built on wealth or bloodline, but on intention, compassion, and truth. And that starts with me and will echo long after I'm gone. Sometimes I think about the future. The day my children are grown, when they look back at their childhood, I don't want them to remember perfection. I want them to remember presence, that their mother showed up, that she listened, that she chose kindness, even when it wasn't modeled for her, that she broke the cycle, and that in doing so, she set them free. That is what I live for now. Not recognition, not reconciliation, but liberation. The kind of love that frees, not binds. The kind that heals. The kind I finally know I deserve. Love, I've learned, is not a transaction. It's not something to be bargained for with obedience or silence. It's a choice, a practice, a truth we carry into every moment, especially the hard ones. And in this truth, I finally feel whole. I finally feel home. And that's the kind of love I'll never apologize for giving or receiving. The other day, my son asked me what my parents were like. I paused, then told him they taught me a lot, mostly about the kind of parent I didn't want to be. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. Maybe it did. We were sitting in the backyard, watching the twins chase fireflies. Chris was lighting the grill, music humming through the open kitchen window. Everything about the moment felt full. Not perfect, but present. And that, I've learned, is more than enough. Sometimes I think back to who I used to be, the girl trying to shrink herself to fit someone else's mold, the woman who equated love with sacrifice, the daughter who kept hoping for a different version of the same people. She was brave, she held on for longer than she should have. But I'm not her anymore. Now I hold space for joy, for complexity, for new beginnings. Some stories don't end in reconciliation, some chapters close without fanfare, and that's okay, because not every door has to reopen for healing to be real. I no longer chase apologies that won't come. I no longer beg for love that should have been given freely. Instead, I let go, and in that letting go, I've made room for so much more. More peace, more truth, more moments like this one, barefoot in the grass, watching my children laugh beneath a lavender sky. That's the life I've built. That's the story I'm still writing. And every day, I get to decide how it unfolds. Not them, not the past. Always me. There are still days when the memories sneak up on me. A smell, a phrase, a song, and suddenly I'm back in that old house, hearing the laughter that wasn't meant for me, feeling the weight of being unseen. But the difference now is I don't stay there. I honor the feeling, I breathe through it, and then I come back to now, to the life I chose, to the love I built. Sometimes healing feels like a quiet triumph, like sitting at the dinner table while the kids tell wild stories about their day and realizing you've created a world where they feel safe to be loud, silly, unfiltered, where they know they're wanted. Sometimes it feels like holding Chris's hand in the dark and saying nothing, because nothing needs to be said, because everything is understood. Sometimes it's just looking in the mirror and liking what you see, not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. I've learned that breaking cycles isn't about grand gestures, it's about the tiny, consistent choices, telling the truth, honoring boundaries, choosing love without condition, again and again. And every time I choose differently, I rewrite the story, not just for myself, but for my children, for their future, for anyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. My life doesn't look like what I once imagined. It's better. And that's the beauty of healing. It makes room for possibilities we didn't know we were allowed to hope for. Maybe my children will grow up and never know what it's like to question their worth. Maybe they'll never sit in therapy wondering why they weren't enough. Maybe they'll just live free, whole, loved. And if that's all I leave behind in this world, then it's more than enough. It's everything.